The potential for the National Food Strategy is really significant over the next 10 years to really join the dots on making sure the farming and food system that we envisage after Brexit is the one that really delivers for health, for planetary health, for society and for the economy, for animals, and globally, for our global responsibility on our trading patterns and on people globally. That's a big ask of something, but we're very pleased that Henry is leading on this and having a fantastically extensive conversation with people across the country, and I'm sure he'll talk about that. But it really needs to deliver for food poverty, in particular for the nation's health, but also make the connection between ecological health and our health. That absolutely fundamentally what we need to change about what's been happening up till now. We've had different silos of environmental good practice in farming, and then the food system left to the big corporations to do with what they may, and some good practice there, but we know where we are in terms of obesity, tooth decay, poor mental health due to dietary disease, etc. And there is also the role of the workers in the food system, which is, I think, the largest employer in the country in terms of sector. 1 in 7 people working in the food system. They need to be protected, nurtured, and supported as well. And that's, as I said, a big tall order for Henry. So can I give you the floor? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I thought we were talking about local food systems, yes. But I'm very happy to talk more broadly about the National Food Strategy.
That's a subject, yes.
That's subject. Yes. One of the encouraging things about the food system, and particularly the farming system that I see at the moment, is the increasing reconnection between the people who for a long time have been pursuing traditional means of farming with large corporate farmers who are realizing that they need some of that know-how to redevelop their soils, to increase biodiversity on their land, to reduce their chemical inputs. And that is witnessed by the increasing amount of traffic between the Oxford Farming Conference and the Oxford Real Farming Conference. The downside of that is that there may be people in this room who saw me speak half an hour ago at the Oxford Farming Conference. So if you're one of those, apologies if some of this seems a little repetitive. The National Food Strategy, the scope of the National Food Strategy is broad, sometimes terrifyingly so. Our job is to work across all departments of government and in society more broadly to build a robust food system that provides affordable, good food for everyone, restores the environment, maintains the countryside, brings good jobs to our communities, urban and rural, and stops making us sick. In short, a system that we would be proud to leave our children. The brief is big and complicated because it has to be. Looking at this system over the last year or so, it has been impossible not to be amazed by how beautiful, hugely complex and interconnected it is. The logistical tapestry of our food system brings sustenance, so much pleasure to so many people. It bestows on us a variety of food that would be unimaginable to previous generations. It shapes our beautiful landscapes. I spoke to a Danish farmer the other day and said, what would you do with the food strategy? And he said, well, you've still got your landscape and we've destroyed ours, so I'd hang on to that if I were you. It feeds our cities, it's the backbone of rural communities, and at the same time it provides 1 in 7 people in this country with a job, including me. And despite all this, as we are increasingly aware, and those of you in this room might argue you have been aware for longer than most of society, it is causing harms. And I think that the way in which we need to address those harms and the solution to those harms is to go back and look at how we got to where we got to today, these harms didn't come about by accident. They didn't come about as the work of a malevolent devil. They came about as the result of human ingenuity trying to solve a problem that they saw facing them. And it's a story of that ingenuity. It's a story of success, but it's also a story of unintended consequences. And I want briefly to talk about that story. And a lot of you will be familiar with it, but I think it's critical to understand how we go forward from here, to understand that after the war in 1945, we were facing an even greater existential crisis. We, despite all the bloodshed, the population of the world through the 19th century up to the beginning of the war had gone from 1 billion to 2.5 billion. Scientists saw the improvements in medicine, they saw the improvements in nutrition. They predicted that that 2.5 billion was going to go to 9 billion in the next 100 years. And they foresaw mass starvation. In the past, the answer to that would have been to have dug up more ground to farm on. That's how the human race for 12 at that stage, almost 12,000 years, had dealt with requiring more food. They had dug up more land and farmed more land. But it was clear that that was not going to be possible. There simply wouldn't be enough land to plant that food on. And I was talking about this with Jyoti the other day. What these people had not reckoned with was with Norman Borlaug. Now, a name now in some circles treated with disdain, but at the time, Borlaug grew up in the Great Depression in Iowa. He saw people starving on the street. He saw riots, food riots. And when he went to Mexico in 1944, he was absolutely horrified by the state of the peasant farmers living hand to mouth with terrible harvests in terrible poverty. And he made it his mission to improve the yields on their wheat. And he worked pretty much alone. Everyone thought he was a nutter. He had a dirt-floored research hut where he slept. He bred by hand hundreds of thousands of wheat plants, which means chopping off the stamens so that the plant can't fertilize itself, putting a little envelope over the top of the plant, getting the floret from another plant, popping the pollen into the envelope. It's a very, very painstaking process. And he was lucky, and he would admit he was lucky, that he managed to cross a wheat rust-resistant wheat with a short-stem wheat, with a high-yielding wheat. And when he arrived in 1944, Mexico imported 60% of its grain, and by 1956 it was self-sufficient, and that work then went to India and to Pakistan, and then across the world in what we now know as the Green Revolution. And as expected, the population soared. At the time, the average life expectancy was 46. It's now 73. 1 in 5 children died as infants. That's now 1 in 20. And famine this century has become an issue of food distribution rather than lack of food production. But, as so often happens, when you solve one problem, you create other problems. And Borlaug created 3, or his system created 3, broadly speaking. The first was that as the amount of food in society increased, so we got heavier. It shouldn't be a surprise. We evolved in a world where calories were short. We love to eat highly dense food. Our palates have evolved to eat it. And the obesity epidemic, the health epidemic that we see now, isn't some short-term, it's not something that was caused by, as some people tell you, by low-fat yogurts in the 80s. It has been coming towards us for 70 years as gradually we ate more of these calories. And if you look at a bell curve of the weight of the population, the average population weight, BMI in 1950 was 20. That's now on the borderline between ideal weight and underweight. And you gradually see it moving to the right as calories increased until in the early 80s, the tail of the bell curve hit obesity. Significant numbers of us became obese, and we started getting sick. And that carried on. And what is frightening about that bell curve is it has now developed a long tail So there is a tail to the right, because some of us are much, much more susceptible to this environment than others. So you now have more people who are severely obese than you would have imagined if the bell curve had kept its shape. So it's not surprising that in this country you can now buy 28 different flavors of Kit Kat. You know, they're easier to sell than runner beans. And also, Borlaug's work made these refined fats, refined carbohydrates, refined sugar cheap, so you had that as well. It's not surprising that 18 of the largest food and drink companies have portfolios where 85% of the products are deemed by the WHO to be unsuitable for marketing to children. This isn't a global conspiracy. There isn't a boardroom full of people somewhere saying, how do we kill the children? What is happening is that you have this horrific coming together of genetics and economics that is being proved irresistible in causing health problems. The second thing, and this is probably where this conference started, was that as the number of calories, the amount of the yield of food in any given hectare of land increased, so again you might say, unsurprisingly, the other wildlife occupying that same hectare of land decreased. And there are obviously a number of reasons for that. But basically, if you look at, for example, wheat yields have doubled since 1970 at exactly the same time as the number of birds on our land have halved. I don't need to tell you that we have the worst performance on the European Bird Farmland Index. We've lost 44 million birds since 1966. We've lost 99% of our wildflower meadows, half our ancient woodland, 3/4 of our heathland, and 3/4 of our pond. So we have had this massive increase in yield of food and a destruction of biodiversity in other forms. And then finally, there's something that Borlaug could not possibly have known, which is that every single step of this process, this farming process, released carbon. So from cutting up of forests to plant crops, the energy-intensive manufacture of fertilizer, the release of carbon from degrading soils, the methane produced by rice paddies and by livestock, the energy used in manufacturing plants and retail, the fuel used to drive cars in the logistical system. And it's now estimated that the total global carbon emissions from the food system are 20 to 30%. In the UK, production, it's under 20%, but when you look at what we import, it goes up to 30%, and I'll talk about importing and trade in a moment. So that's a really simple story. We focused on a risk, growing enough food so we didn't starve, and we largely solved that problem. But as we increased the amount of food that was available, we ate more, we got fat, and as we got fat, we got sick. And as we increased the amount of food we grow on our land, we drove out nature, we increased the carbon emissions. And you might say, well, why is that a hopeful story? It doesn't sound like a very hopeful story to me. The reason for me that it is really an important starting place is because it shows that if we know what we want from a system, we can make it deliver it. If we can align behind a common vision, as I think for our children's sake we have to, we can pivot the system from one that's been really good at delivering sustenance, at delivering pleasure, at delivering jobs, and for some, slightly unequally balanced profit, to one that does that but also restores and enhances our environment and sequesters carbon. So the first thing that we are keen to do with the National Food Strategy is to try and align not only the food sector but citizens more broadly behind a vision that recognizes, without blaming, without shouting, without abusing, that recognizes that we created a system that has gone wrong and that is not only within all of our power but is behoven on us to work together to change that system. But obviously there is going to be a lot more detail required, and I've got to briefly touch on some of that if I've got time. So, first of all, I think the framing of carbon in terms of production is fundamentally wrong. So there is no point in doing an enormous amount of work required to create a net zero system here and then simply importing that carbon from abroad. The same goes for animal welfare, for biodiversity, for environmental pollution. It is insane, and it should be a red line that as a society we fight vigorously. The standards that we have here should be the standards that we apply to the stuff that we import from abroad. Secondly, I think we have to have a more nuanced discussion on cost. So I think that the discussion on cost has become hopelessly polarized. You have on the one side people saying food needs to be more expensive, we need to cost in the externalities, and on the other side you have people saying, oh, but what about people who can't afford to put food on the table, this is going to make it too expensive for them. Those are two completely separate arguments. There's one argument which we need to consider about what is the true cost of food. I don't know if it'll get more expensive or not, there's all sorts of things feeding into that, but you need to deal with the externalities. And there's a completely separate argument about why some people in our society can't afford to put food on the table. But environmental degradation and widespread illness are not viable long-term solutions to the problem of poverty. Dauntingly, we also have to talk about meat. I think meat, again, is an area where the tone of the debate has been unpleasant, and you've basically got a dialogue of the deaf with people who don't really care what the people on the other side are saying. They're not listening, they're making their own points. And that's kind of fine, but actually we're dealing with our children's future, and the decisions we make on this are important. And the work that we need to do, I hope, is to bring more light and a bit less heat to that debate, setting out clearly the different farming systems, from feedlots on lands cleared from rainforest to cattle reared on permanent pasture or those in regenerative agroecological rotations. We need to look at the impact of soy fed to chicken and to pork. We need to think in each case, what are the animal welfare concerns, what are the carbon concerns, how much pollution does each create here and abroad. We need to think about ruminants and the role they play in our diet, in improving our soils, and in the broader farm ecosystem. And that is something that we're going to lay out in depth in our interim report. I'll probably then emigrate to Brazil and come off Twitter until it's... 3 more minutes. So I just want to finish. The final thing, and I think the critical thing, and this comes down to the local food system, is what kind of diversity we want in the food system. In his wonderful book, Linked, Albert Laszlo Barabasi describes the characteristics of networks, human cells, food systems, the internet, it doesn't matter, but the mathematical attributes of these networks. And he argues that we are thinking about nature's networks in the wrong way. He says that scientists, and he is a physicist, have tried to understand nature by disassembling it, by breaking matter down into elements, into electrons spinning around protons, and then into neutrons, into quarks, by thinking of nutrition in terms of vitamins and minerals, proteins, fiber, and so forth. And he says we've spent trillions of research dollars on this project, like a child taking apart his favorite toy. That we're as close to knowing everything there is to know about the pieces, but we're as far as we have ever been from understanding nature as a whole. Riding reductionism, we run into the hard wall of complexity. Nature is not a well-designed puzzle with only one way to put it back together. This is almost the opposite of the Borlaug philosophy of creating a three-tiered system of good genes, nitrogen, and irrigation. Barabasi would argue that we need to think not just about biodiversity, but about all the different forms of diversity we want in the food system to make it robust, of seeds and seed banks, of crops planted in fields, of foods in our diets, of types of agricultural systems, of ports and infrastructure, of local and global supply. And that, I think, is going to be the key to, again, bringing together. That feels to me like the old wisdom expressed in the language of new science. And I think understanding, having discussions about local and global, for example, which will come on today, which are not about one is good and one is bad, but about what is the mix, what kinds of forms of these do we want, where is it appropriate to have one and where the other, will be critical to creating a strategy that we can all align behind as a country. We publish our interim report in spring. We have citizens' assemblies. A lot of this stuff is not stuff I can decide. It's stuff that the people of the country need to decide. What do they want our countryside to look like? What role do they want the government to play in helping them eat better diets? So we have a citizens' assembly in September, and then we will be publishing our final strategy in the winter. And the government have said they will come back and respond to it with a white paper 6 months after that. I really, through all of the complexity and some of the passion and even vitriol in the arguments, I am fundamentally optimistic, because every farm that I have visited, whether it is the smallest smallholding or the largest corporate enterprise, already gets it. And I think we are in a place where we weren't 10 years ago, where we really can unite the country again behind a common vision to create a better food system for our children. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Jyoti to do the hardest thing she has to do, which is to respond in 5 minutes.
So we get to put a bet on whether that's going to happen.
These sessions are so short, but we want to give you a chance to speak, to say comments. So if you can, Jyoti, 5 minutes.
I just have to choose one or two things to speak about. Yeah, so Henry, thank you so much. It was really great hearing all of what you've had to say, and also the fact that you've been conversing quite a lot with so many of us about developing this strategy and really kind of be able to hold that complexity of what we need to do in your head. Very quickly, when you were speaking about Norman Borlaug and that move towards we needed more food, I just have to respond a little bit to the description and the idea of what's happened with our peasantry and the people that live on the land and live in harmony with the land. And in that we believe that agroecology and local food systems are really an extension of our ecosystem. That the people who live closest in low-impact lifestyles in connection with the land is actually a way forward to the future. And that is something that has systematically throughout history been frowned upon. And that kind of move towards the Green Revolution in the 1950s, when people were very reductionistly thinking about that, was also sort of colored by a perception that living on the land, working on the land, and that kind of thing was actually a backwards and dirty sort of thing. And it was moving along at the same time as that our trade was liberalizing into the WTO, that corporate control of agriculture was increasing, and it was built upon a legacy of colonialism, where we really were thinking about how we can extract as many resources from other parts of the planet and sort of, deliberately kind of putting other cultures that lived in different ways in harmony with their local ecosystem into a negative light. And I think that's important to think about all those historical geopolitical things that were going on at the same time as we were transitioning to these high-yield variety systems that now have almost pushed us to the brink of ecological disaster in what we're doing. At the same time as thinking of those as a foundation and recouping that idea that local food systems, agroecology, are actually something we can build upon on the future, and that we've got to have ultimate respect for those peasant farmers and peasant farming. As somebody who works for an organization of 200 million peasant farmers across the land, providing 70% of our global food supply, I had to say that. Anyway, so what I don't know where to focus exactly, but part of, I think, of the essence of what we are trying to achieve through a local food strategy is that agroecological, localized food, plus fair imports and supply chains that help provide some income for people across the world, should be affordable and accessible to all, that good quality food should be there for everybody, and that we haven't to leave enough room for nature in our planet at the same time and restore the damage that we've done to it. So all of those things just kind of sum up what we need out of food strategy. And Henry's right that I feel diversity is the heart of that, diversity of scales of different farmings, different types of systems, different types of crops, all of that. And that it's been a real market failure that this type of food that is the good quality stuff that we need, organic food, has become a real niche. It's been governed by the market, and where we go with that has been governed by the market. And there's been little government intervention to ensure that that kind of good quality, healthy, accessible, agroecological food is available to everyone. And there are clear government interventions that can happen in order to make that possible. But until we take the right to food seriously, the fact that it is everybody's basic sovereign right to have access to this good quality food that doesn't destroy the ability of future generations to produce that food, then we don't have the freedom to do that kind of market interventions within this very neoliberal economy that we live in. And so I think spelling those out for Henry as we go along, what are the things that we can specifically do in the projects that loads of us are engaged in, whether it's community-supported agriculture farms, whether it's different horticulture projects doing direct sales for very good prices, ones that integrate the community, those types of sort of community-facing projects, or whether it's trying to run an agroecological farm that uses low input yields and restores the environment and all this sort of things. All these types of projects feed in somewhere into one of the solutions that needs to be there. And I think we need to really work together to compile this evidence base that really proves our case for agroecological local food being a really high proportion of the ultimate mosaic of what we need as the solution to this. Because it has been underinvested in, it's been marginalized by the global market-facing industrial agricultural system since the 1950s, and all the faith is poured into that, and one has competed against each other. And our sector has not received as much support. And we've got to make the case for bringing that up as a potential solution to all the negative trade-offs that have resulted from this increase in industrialized agriculture. That we've got lots more calories in the world today. We've got enough calories to feed a population of 10 billion now, and loads of it is wasted. We still got hungry people. What's going on? We've got to figure out how we do this better. Very quickly, maybe if I have one more minute, I've been wanting to, over Christmas holiday, because I've just really felt extremely passionate about, we've got to make this case solid and robust, because this is the future of our food system for a very long time here in the UK. But the cases between land sharing versus land sparing, and looking at that and seeing can we fit in what we need? And looking at the idea of food sovereignty, that we should be producing as much as we can here. I'm a great believer that the British Empire should actually think very carefully about extending into other territories before we start exporting our food somewhere else, and our food production somewhere else. So how much of that can we produce ourselves, and then what should we sensibly import, and how could that be traded? And what kind of production systems can we have? And yeah, it's all very interesting. And when you look at the, sort of land take for conventional farming systems and, organic farming systems, the difference isn't huge. But then when we start integrating agroecological farming systems, then we get more and more land that we can do. And then we can think about importing most of our wine, some of our sugar, a little bit of our arable, maybe, 50% of our fruit so we can still have oranges and bananas, that kind of thing. Then we start to get a scenario that actually it comes clear that we could still have a really healthy proportion of our food supply being produced through local and regional and domestic economies, and all the jobs and all the landscape attributes and all the public health benefits that's got, and at the same time as feeding our global population. And I think when you start to do a balancing exercise on where do we want our food system to go, it shines very, very beautifully resonance on agroecological local food.
Thanks. Jyoti. Thank you very much. And I'm sure you'll be publishing that at some point. Dee, can you give us 5 minutes if you can?
Yeah, I'll try. And I'm going to directly respond to a few statements that Henry said. So, number one, feeds our communities? No. Our food system is failing. We are not feeding our communities. We have millions of people going hungry in the UK. The fifth, or is it sixth richest economy in the world. We have millions of people going hungry. We don't know how many because we don't measure food insecurity in our country. London has done some measurement. DWP are doing some measurement. But there are still people who are outside of that system, so we don't know how many millions of people are going hungry. We have millions of children who got up this morning without breakfast and will probably have no lunch and are going home to no food. So our food system is failing our communities. So you made a statement about some of us being more susceptible to the environment, our food environment. And that's because we are marginalized. And I have to say we, because I'm one of those people. All right, so we're talking women, children, disabled people, or people with long-term health conditions, mental health conditions, refugees. And we need to address those discrepancies, that imbalance of power within British society, but also within our food system. All right, because we are all entitled to a dignified life. Right now, we are not living dignified lives. All right, our children are not living dignified lives. In my day-to-day, I deal with people who fall through the cracks, right? And it takes so much strength for me sometimes to go through the day. When you hear people saying, I had a choice of whether to eat my dog's food or go without. So we need to do something about food poverty in this country. So 1, we need to be measuring it. 2, we need legislation. We need human right to food in legislation nationally. It's one thing signing up to all the national, international conventions on the human right to food and to nutrition as well, right? But we need it in law, right? So that way we can have programs that address access to food and equal access to food. So right now we have universal free school meals for children up to 7. But what happens beyond 7? Nothing. So we have, I think, 1 or 2 local authorities in London who've taken it upon themselves to do that. But we need it as a national, universal free school meal so no child goes hungry in this country. The other thing we need is participation. All right, we need people who are experiencing food insecurity to be parts of any sort of decision making and in, designing the national food strategy. And I would extend that to children and young people as well. We have the excellent child ambassadors, right? They are simply amazing. You need to be listening to them. So what we have food apartheid in this country, right? It's not food swamps and food deserts, it is food apartheid. And the leftover people, the marginalized people, get leftover food, right? We need to be able to access fresh, affordable food and not have to rely on handouts from charities, and most of it being sort of highly processed crap from the industrialized food system. Within sort of farming, right, we need to have localized sort of markets, right? We've lost most of our local markets, especially in cities. So we can't access that fresh, affordable food anymore. We're totally dependent on supermarkets. All right, so we need to be looking at how can we make fresh food truly affordable and accessible to each and every community in the UK. And how can we, expand our growing to the peri-urban and within urban agriculture to support communities. I think we need to be making an economic case, right? No one has really done that. Has anyone done the long-term projections in terms of the costs to our economy, because our children are not being fed and therefore will probably not be attaining in school and will end up sick and not being able to participate in society? Has anyone looked at that case? Yeah?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dee. Lots of challenges there. Thank you very much. And our final responder is Victoria Williams.
Hello. It's a daunting task. And I'm responding, particularly thinking about the barriers that are faced working at a local authority level to this. And over the last 6 years, Food Matters, along with Sustain and the Soil Association, have been working to deliver the Sustainable Food Cities Network, which works with over 50 cities in towns and regions across the UK, facilitating food partnerships, cross-sector food partnerships, food strategies and action plans. And participation and collaborative processes are at the heart of this work. And I suppose these experiences of working at community level are really what inform the comments that I'm making and the feedback that we have from network members. And I think it goes without saying, at least at this conference anyway, that we all want to see an increase to access and affordability of sustainable food. And largely that means that we need to get more sustainably food grown into urban communities, because that's largely where most people live in the main. But we also have to utilise existing mechanisms, what we've talked about. I think all the panellists have said we want a food system that delivers on multiple levels. We want good health, we want environmental protection, we want animal welfare, and we want to provide a good living for those that live on the land, but we also want the cost of food to truly reflect the cost of production. But I would argue and agree with Dee that does have implications for those living on the lowest incomes. And that's where I think local authorities have a part to play. The main issues where local authorities have a role and can influence and be influenced is around health, diet-related disease and the health burden, through work they do on poverty, about reducing inequalities and reducing food poverty, the environmental and climate change, and the economy. But, of course, there are difficulties working with local authorities and local areas, because 10 years of austerity has made it very difficult for local authorities to do anything other than what they're obliged to do legally, and they understandably don't want to do anything that's going to impact on their budgets and targets that they don't have to reach. They're also still very siloed in the way that their functions work, and so that has an impact on innovation and partnership working and knowledge. Also, I think austerity has meant that there's been a loss of skills and knowledge, and with particular reference to the food system, this means that there's been a loss of technical kind of skills and experience, particularly around implementing sustainable procurement and sustainable provision, and a lack of planning for healthy environments. So why do we want to work with local authorities, and why if it's that tricky? But they still offer and are well placed to influence local food systems. And as institutions, they have quite a lot of devices that can help affect change. They have levers through procurement. They buy a lot of food. Through planning, they can promote and protect land for food growing. Through land ownership, a lot of local authorities own quite big swathes of land, through community farms, through allotments and land on housing estates. And you can also use structures, infrastructure and strategic policy work around things such as community plans, core plans, food strategies. And they also offer and can play a critical role in leadership around food systems change. And given the scale of the tasks that we've heard that we have to do, we kind of believe that collaboration is vital if we're going to see fundamental food systems change. And the sustainable food systems approach is happening at a time when there is a move for local authorities to be more, to take on board place-based approaches and asset-based approaches. They want to be seen as conveners rather than leaders, and they are open to collaborative working. The Sustainable Food Cities approach is a useful framework in which we can communicate sustainable food and what that agenda means at a local authority level, whether that's unitary authority or whether it's two-tier, or whether it's boroughs or metropolitan. It affords a pathway to engagement. And the model is based on 6 themes, all of which local authorities have to work, including waste, procurement, public health, poverty, etc. So, what do we want from the National Food Strategy?
1 minute.
Okay. So, I think, as Dee said, participation and inclusion is really important, and I think it's really welcomed that the work that the food strategy team have been doing is really great around the country, listening and hearing what people have to say. And we'd like to see that mechanism in place and see that continue throughout the process and on an ongoing basis. I suppose really what we want is, there's four things really. We'd like the National Food Strategy to support cross-sector local food partnerships across the UK, and we'd like that to happen through a central government-funded programme that's passed out through local authorities. We want the National Food Strategy to continue to support and develop a framework that enables local food work, but we also know that there are things that can't be addressed through just local food work, and that includes planning policy. We'd like to see national planning policy that allows food systems planning to be implemented at a local level. We'd like to see increasing investment in prevention. Frame any future national policy work so that preventative action is valued even though the benefits might not be seen for 10 to 20 years. And key to this in terms of procurement is to ensure that social value is properly considered in procurement, a central part of a contract rather than just to add it on. And I think the last point is, which Dee was talking about quite strongly, is in terms of household food insecurity, which is predominantly an issue of poverty. And so national level action is required to tackle in-work poverty. And so we'd like to see a supporting for the Living Wage Foundation's living wage. We'd like to see stopping use of insecure hours and 0 hours contracts, which is widely seen in the food and farming industry. I mean, just a headline, I was just saying the headline today in The Guardian was HMRC catches only 13% of firms not paying minimum wage. So there is a lot to do, but I think a systems partnership approach is the way forward.
I thought the headline in The Guardian today was farming will be redundant in 15 years.
Let's not go there. not here. Thank you very much. Well, there was an awful lot in 15 minutes of responses covering, can we have children on your advisory panels, Henry? And can we do something to address local authorities' role, all the potential they have for a role, the market failure that Jyoti covered. I mean, I don't know if I could open it up to the floor while you're sort of maybe thinking of some responses to that. Is that all right? Questions? So questions, and we have a roving mic. We'll start with that gentleman there, just randomly. Oh, yes, okay. And really, please keep it short in questions or very short statement.
Okay. Hello, my name's Derwin Banks. Thank you, Henry. That, I think, was quite a good summing up, but I would invite you to think about how something would be implemented that would help. And I think the government has a role there. And what we're basically talking about is our health is being overwhelmed by non-communicable disease all over the world, which could be loosely translated as food-related disease. And we need to start dealing with that at its source. But there's a gap. At the moment, all of our money is going to the pharmaceutical industry to try and solve that problem, whereas it's the food industry that needs to solve the problem. And I think what the government needs to do is recognise that gap and say, we're going to put the funding in that gap so that we can have good food for everybody, but it means moving the money out of the pharmaceutical industry.
I think that was a sort of comment to you. I think you can take that on board very much so. I'll do male-female, so I want this lady here.
Thank you, very interesting. I would like to commend Dee on her comments and say I read a thing recently saying that children who don't have breakfast get 2 grades less in their GCSEs. And I would like to urge the government to support organic farming. We know from the UN reports that biodiversity and climate change are huge problems. And if organic farming was was rolled out so everyone was eating healthy organic food and there wasn't this food apartheid, and it shouldn't be a niche, expensive product. It should be something that's the norm in our society.
I think in other countries, European countries, it's a far higher percentage of organic on the shelves and affordable. I don't know if you're going to be talking about that hopefully talking about that in your reports?
Definitely. I mean, France, for example, has...
Yeah, so...
I know. Is it on there? Does that work?
Yeah, it was just mentioning that France has a high proportion of... And they also source for schools.
I suppose with age, I'm increasingly sceptical and long in the tooth about how government will take on board some of the recommendations. So having been involved in the Green Food Project, Food Vision 2030, initial food matters over the last 10 or so years, those are all attempts at creating an integrated food and farming vision that have got absolutely nowhere. So my question is, what conversations have you had with Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, the real leadership at the moment, beyond Teresa Villiers, to ensure that the recommendations that come out from your work are really integrated into government strategy so that they form the basis of international trade negotiations with the US, they form the focus of the Department of Health's work, DFID, etc. So there's a real integrated approach.
Great question. Would you able to respond to that?
Can I answer Can I answer a couple of things? I'll answer the questions that Dee raised about poverty,
Sure,
and then also come on to something that vexes me a lot, which is how do we make sure it doesn't just get put on a shelf. So on food poverty, our role here is, I think, first of all, to describe the system. So I think we have an obligation to set out the issues of, for whatever reason, people not being able to put food on the table, and explain why that is. I don't think my role is to re-engineer the universal credit system, but it is important for me to explain what's going on. I also think that there are ways in which the food system can assuage, mitigate those problems. So, infant universal free school meals, for example, was actually a recommendation that came out of the school food plan, which I wrote in 2013. And I now set up a charity with an amazing woman called Nicole Pisani, and we set it up pretty much early last year. We're now working in 25 schools, transforming their cooking, their food education. And I think there is a lot that you can do, that people in those roles can do, if liberated to do it, that can help with those problems. We try and keep the schools open over the summer, etc., etc., etc. So I think there will be room. I think the job of the plan, of this strategy, is to define the problem, define what we're not going to tackle, because it's not our role, but be clear about that, and then say, how can the food system change anyway to mitigate those problems? On will government respond, it is something that that I thought about long and hard. I'm taking a sabbatical year unpaid to do this, and I thought quite long and hard about whether I thought there was any chance of it having any impact before I did that. It's something we as a team talk about every day, which is how do we maximize the chances of getting traction? And the whole way in which we've set it up, from Gove agreeing in the terms of reference to, if you look at the terms of reference that he agreed to, they're very strongly worded. They talk about government needing to act. They state the problems in the terms of reference. They say they'll do a white paper. They asked me to come back and review it after 12 months. To the whole process with large amounts of citizen engagement, citizens' assemblies. We're bringing in cross-party support. We are doing everything we can to make it as easy as possible for the government to respond. Boris is big. I don't know particularly well. I worked with him when I was a journalist years and years ago. Gove is completely behind this stuff. He believes it. I know everyone hates him, but he believes it. He understands it, and he really wants to make it happen. He was the one actually who, behind the scenes, made universal free school meals happen, and I trust him to deliver on this. Not necessarily a popular point of view. Cummings, I think, really likes the ability of our food system. He's very, very interested in the levelling up of society, and I think that if we can put this into that framework, I think we have a good chance of getting traction. So I have absolutely no guarantees that we will achieve anything. All we have is a slightly optimistic outlook and a very, very stubborn determination to use every means, both fair and foul, to try and have an impact.
Thank you. Did you say Boris is very much for it?
Boris is big. So Boris is really big on he's serious about the environmental stuff. He's really. I even think that. I mean, I don't know. I haven't spoken about it, but I think if you look at the thing that's being held against him is the sin tax thing. Oh, we don't like sin taxes. If you look at the context of that, it was said in an off-the-cuff response to someone who asked it at an election rally. So I have been encouraged since Gove left. We've got a better team even from DEFRA. Teresa Villas is behind it. We've got support from Cabinet Office. Matt Hancock in Health is really encouraging us to be radical and bold. So, I wouldn't be here if I'm not here just to, do whatever. We're here to try and change something.
Thank you. That's useful. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on those, or should I go to more questions? Okay. Another question. I think we're on female now. Any females? Any females? There we go. We're on females. Yes, there. Lady there. Oh, it's Honor.
Honor Eldridge with the Sustainable Food Trust. You've been talking about the impact that food systems have on public health and on education, the impact that food businesses can have to driving more sustainable consumption. You've mentioned the ministers of state that you're working with and the Prime Minister, but how much are you engaging with the civil servants across the different departments in BEIS, in the Department of Education, Department of Public Health, to drive forward that message at this stage in the process, rather than bringing them a final strategy to sign off?
So at this stage in two ways, and then that is a big part of the thinking for how we make the final recommendation. So at this stage, we have co-opted people from other departments onto our team. So we have a team member from BEIS, we have a team member from Cabinet Office. We're keen to get a team member from Health actually working on the team. We've also got some really smart people they've let us take some really smart people from outside government, which is fantastic. And we have a cross-Whitehall working group. So the number twos in each of the departments are regularly reviewing the work, and then I'm building relationships with the Perm Sec. So that's kind of the other interesting question is, how do you keep that how do you keep that consensus together? So the problem here you have is that you need a strategy that works across departments. BEIS and Health have very different objectives when it comes to the food system. DEFRA and Trade have different objectives. And you can, if you look at attempts to hold them together in the past, generally you'll get something that's announced as a cross-governmental initiative, and gradually it will kind of dissolve. But if you dropped the civil service, it would break very clearly into departmental lines. It's very, very hierarchical because of the politicians. Actually, not the civil servants would like it to be much more collaborative, but in the end it's driven by the politicians. And so we are thinking about do you need a structural legal mechanism to hold those things together once we publish. One of the bright sides is that Mark Sedwill is doing a big push across the civil service to encourage more engagement on the big challenges our society faces. So I think at least the kind of direction of travel of the civil service is in that direction.
Great.
There's a lot of discussion about the problems, the solutions with regards to food poverty, which I don't think any of us are in any denial about, but I think we're missing a pretty critical issue which I need to be talked about as far as UK food strategy is concerned. With the average age of British farmers being over 60 years old, and perhaps less than 10% under the age of 40, how are we going to address actually the production issue of no farmers? To all the panel, I think it's quite important.
Okay. Then anybody? Do you want to comment on that, Jyoti? Yeah. Do you want to comment?
Well, I don't think if we made farming an attractive job opportunity, I don't think we actually have any shortage of people willing to go into agriculture. And there's this blooming, vibrant movement now. I mean, why we've got so many people here, you know, and lots of people really wanting to start upon farming. But we've got to remove the structural barriers that make it very difficult, like access to land. We've got to give proper startup grants. We've got to give really good training. We've got to ensure that they've got some sort of viable livelihood to do it. And I think the people will come, you know, as long as those pieces are in place. And it happens all across the world with people, you know, either becoming like, you know, mixed computer engineers and small-scale farmers at the same time and that type of thing. And I think people are attracted to independent job opportunities, so they actually get some reward for what they're doing, and they might juggle it with another job at the same time. But also the fact that it has real meaning, and that it's actually contributing to making this a viable, livable planet, which is viable for them at the same time. And if we can create those opportunities, put the grants and the access to land in there, it'll happen.
Thank you. Have we got any questions specifically about local food systems? Because we are, I mean, that is a focus in a way for this session, but obviously everything's like all connected. Any? Oh, well, I'll get, Christopher's had a hand up for a while. He's down here. Blue shirt, sorry.
Thanks for that excellent presentation and also really good responses from the panel. Henry, you know I'm going to ask this question, but how could we get the NFS to back organic farming? We had a question which you didn't respond to over there from the woman over there. It seems to me to match the 6 purposes of your strategy perfectly, as do other systems as well, I'm sure, but it certainly does match the purposes. It's particularly important, it's well established and it works to a clear system with legally binding standards. It's attractive to people, they want to have it, younger people particularly, it's the sort of coming generation thing. It's a farming system that operates, I'm talking about farming on the ground, getting more organic acres in this country. It's got a clear market, and with a push from the NFS, I think you could make a big difference which would pivot system change. And I think the fact that we consistently seem to avoid mentioning it is a disservice to the organic farmers that are here, and also a disservice to the future of a viable food system. And we're looking at a diversity of solutions, not one size fits all. Organic must be part of that diversity, or would you rather get rid of it?
Thanks, Christopher. Do you want to respond to that now? And then can I ask the other panellists if they want to do a minute, any final thoughts afterwards?
I can, do you want me to do my final thoughts as well?
Yes, final thoughts, including
I'll
organic.
respond to that and then a final thought. So, response to that is, there's a question about how we relate to all of the other things going on in government, and we're thinking about that because we're not going to double down, we're not going to duplicate the work of everything else that's going on in government. We need to work out where we need to get involved, where we need to top and tail things. And obviously the environmental land management scheme would be the perfect vehicle to support organic. You have £3 billion of public money that is no longer going to be spent producing food, but is going to be spent on public goods, carbon in soils, biodiversity, mitigating floods, sequestering carbon. Patrick here is involved in one of the many trials to understand in situations where you can't pay for outcomes. So, for example, sequestering carbon in soil, the technology just isn't there at the moment to be able to measure before and after in any kind of meaningful way the carbon in a farmer's soil. And therefore, we might need to rely on processes. And organic would be one of many. I think organic now, with the variation of agroecological processes, in terms of the nomenclature, you had to be careful, but the government will be paying for agroecological processes. It's very clear in the direction of the ELM's work. What is our role there? Well, my only concern about ELMS, I think it is brilliantly conceived. I think it is absolutely conceptually the right thing. I think there are many, it's going to be really difficult to do. The detail is hard, and there are many ways in which they could slip back and it could become something like CAP. Not again through any evil influence, but just because it gets too hard. And I think our job in that area is to stand alongside them, hold them to account, ensure, from an independent point of view, that it is delivering what it set out to deliver. More broadly, in retrospect, and this comes back to the question about how we get impact. If I could ask you to do one thing today, it would be to go to our website, nationalfoodstrategy.org. We need, when we launch this and during the process, leadership from across the sector, dispersed leadership across the country. Government cannot do this alone. It can indicate, it can set direction, it can do some policies, but it needs people in communities, in food systems across the country. If you want to get involved, to hold one of these dialogues in your town, in your village, in your community, if you want to get involved to become an ambassador when we launch, if you just want to give us some good ideas or keep up with what we're doing, the most powerful thing that we can create at this point is a group of people who really care about this, who will go out and spread the word. So if you can sign up, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Henry. Does anybody want to make one sentence? Because I've been given the, we've nearly finished. Does anybody want to comment? Or?
I'd just like to say that we'd like to see an ongoing commitment to the collaboration, participation and the consultation of the National Food Strategy, and see that through delivery and this process.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. And shameless plug, in the interest of diversity and participation, the next session is a Young People's Assembly convened by the crowdsource of People's Food Policy happening in the church.
Great. And Jyoti, you're right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the responders, and thank you to Henry. And big round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thank you.